just we are asking. So at Emory, Professor Fineman works on a number of projects. One of the very kind of seminal ones was the Feminism Legal Theory Project, which was inaugurated in 1984. And the current project, the Vulnerability and Human Conditions Initiative, emerged from the Feminism Legal Theory Project in 2008, and at the moment comprises the bulk of Professor Fineman's current research and writing. So she has an array of publications, some of which I know you have read by now, so I won't go through them, but we are really pleased, Martha, that you can be here and look forward to your presentation. So I'm just going to pass it on to you, and then I'll come back when it's discussion time to moderate. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Woodruff, for the introduction, and I'm really happy to be talking to you today, although I do wish I were there in person. It would have been nice, but COVID interfered. In this talk on vulnerability theory, I'm primarily concerned with three questions. The first question is, what is the relationship between power or authority and responsibility? And here I want to put the emphasis on responsibility. And that question or that inquiry involves questions of legitimacy, so the legitimacy of the governing body. The second question is, how do we understand the individual, and how is the individual positioned within the larger society and its institutions? And now this positioning of the individual is significant for how we reconcile things like individual freedom with the notion of collective responsibility. So this is a question of applied power. How is the individual positioned in regard to the state? Third question, how do we as critical scholars incorporate our insights about power, responsibility, individuals, and collectives in identifying and addressing the most pressing subjects of theoretical concern? And this is a really important question for all of us today. There's a tendency for discussions about power and responsibility to be framed in abstract terms, referencing aspirational objectives, liberty, dignity, equality, and so on, or warning of adverse consequences from things like oppression, subordination, or domination. I begin with a more fundamental or practical approach to questions of governmental power and authority, so not with these abstractions. Vulnerability theory concedes the inevitability of some set of enforceable rules to regulate and mediate our interactions with each other, as well as the necessity for some form of governing authority to establish those rules. So it begins with the notion that some governing authority is essential and necessary. Of course, there are options for sources of authority and rules. The market, dominated by multinational corporations, for example, can set rules that govern our relationships with each other. Religion is another, or industries such as those controlling pharmaceuticals or insurance coverage. And recently, we see organizations like the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys attempting to fill in where their perceived legitimate authority on the part of the state is failing in the American electoral context. Also, you might view this as anarchy. The point is that some source of power or authority will be mobilized and rules will be imposed. The question is which power and whose rules? Vulnerability theory advocates for the democratic state in that context, arguing that it is uniquely positioned as the legitimate mechanism for constructing the rules necessary for a just and inclusive society. Now, importantly, and note this, this is not an argument for that the state currently functions in that way, merely that it has more potential for doing so than do the alternatives. This potential for inclusive democratic justice has been impaired and frustrated by impoverished but well-embellished notions of individual equality and liberty, which tolerate only a limited, constrained vision of the state. The resulting diminished notion of state responsibility has left societal well-being to the activities of the hapless individual or displaced it onto large privatized set of unrepresentative and unregulated social institutions, such as the market. Vulnerability theory challenges this impaired vision, drawing on the potential of law to craft a concept of social or inclusive justice built around an ethics of care and collective responsibility. Law is understood here to be a coercive tool of state authority, and it is coercive. One of the primary functions of law is to define and regulate the societal structures and relationships that shape the day-to-day living circumstances of everyone in society. Law thus establishes the background institutions or social structures, the infrastructure in which we live our day-to-day lives, the family, the workplace, the financial and educational system, and so on. In this context, law defines the boundaries and consequences of the relationships we have with each other, as well as establishing our relationship with the governing authority. And importantly, to be perceived as legitimate, these structural laws must be of general or uniform applicability. And we present this uniform or universal principle in maxims such as the rule of law, sayings such as no one is above the law, and through doctrines such as equal protection. This comprehensive, all-encompassing nature of law mandates the construction of what I call a unitary legal subject. And by legal subject, I mean the imagined ordinary being around which law and policy are crafted. This imaginary ordinary being becomes the foundation or elementary human subject of law. And since the effectiveness, appropriateness, and justice of any specific law ultimately will be judged by how well it reflects and addresses the lived reality of real human beings, the authenticity and integrity of this devised being, this legal subject, is critical. The legal subject must encompass and integrate the totality of the human condition. And this is the fundamental principle of a vulnerability analysis. Our legal subject must encompass and integrate the totality of the human condition. Now I'm going to try and share a slide with you, and we'll see how this works. Okay. Oh, okay. Okay. Vulnerability theory approaches the essential task of defining the legal political subject by positing two fundamental questions, and I put them up here for you. First, what does it mean to be human? And then second, given our understanding of what it means to be human, what institutions, relationships, and rules are required for the construction of a just society? This first question, what does it mean to be human, is a descriptive or empirical question. In asking it, we begin to define the nature of the legal and political subject. We are defining the individual subject of law. The second question is a normative or political question, asking us to reflect on the social implications of our humanness, to looking at the position of the individual subject within the collective society, within the society and its institutions. In response to the first question, what does it mean to be human? A vulnerability theorist would respond, to be human is to be vulnerable. Vulnerability constitutes and defines the human condition. Our vulnerability arises from the fact that we are embodied beings, and as such, we are universally, consistently, and constantly susceptible to changes in our bodily and social well-being. There are two components to a vulnerability analysis. We are embodied, and because of the nature and limitations of our embodiment, we are also inescapably embedded in social institutions and relationships. So vulnerability theory begins with the body, or more accurately, begins by reasoning or theorizing from the body. And this distinguishes it from many other approaches. The body is a foundational theoretical concept in vulnerability theory, and the body is an ontological or anthropological concept expressing a fundamental, material, universal reality. Of course, there are differences among bodies that are relevant and currently relevant and to both law and theory. The differences reflected in demographic categories, for example, such as race, sex, and so on, are the basis for law and policies designed to eliminate, rectify, or compensate harms resulting from exclusion, discrimination, marginalization, and so forth. And of course, vulnerability theory recognizes those differences and those specific targeted harms, but also asks us to consider a different, more basic form of difference that is universal, reflecting the shared human condition. These are the developmental differences that each human body will inevitably experience over time. Each human body inevitably changes. And note, important here, the ontological body and its changing is not only or even primarily the site of decline. So the body is not only weak and fragile, but its developmental process generates, even necessitates, innovation, creativity, and initiative. Our intellectual, emotional, and physical capabilities evolve over time, and these changes facilitate creative and constructive adaptations on an individual level. Significantly, on a public policy level, coming back to law, some positive changes can be encouraged or negative changes deterred. Many changes are predictable. But the unavoidable fact about the body is that profound changes are inescapable. And while many are not within our control, some can be anticipated and responded to by law and policy. So this susceptibility to change, this developmental concept of difference is essential to vulnerability theory. And here it is: vulnerability reflects our universal, inescapable susceptibility to change, both positive and negative, in our physical, embodied, and social embedded well-being over life. Of course, these facts about the body and developmental change are perfectly obvious, and I'm sure you're all thinking that on some level. So a fair question might be, why do I dwell on this developmental difference in this presentation? And I do so because the societal and policy implications of this developmental aspect of the ontological body are resisted or ignored both by individuals and by governments. For the most part, the implications of our embodied vulnerability are not reflected in the laws, norms, values, and aspirations that we establish for our society and its institutions. Human vulnerability is not the bedrock of our understanding of responsibility in either its individual or collective dimension. Our legal subject, our ordinary being that defines what's appropriate in terms of law, encompasses abstract notions of equality, freedom, and autonomy as though these were both desirable and attainable human qualities. An idealized legal subject is cast as independent, autonomous, and liberty-seeking, leaving the body behind. And this is the Brooks Brothers version of the typical liberal legal subject. As a result, law and policy only very narrowly defines the interests and legitimate province of the state, diminishing the nature and extent of state or collective responsibility that is necessary for both individual and societal well-being. And I want to note here, and this is important, that law is not alone in this failure to recognize vulnerability and its implications. Other disciplines also neglect the vulnerable subject in spinning out theory. The liberty-seeking, reasonable man we find in law and politics is also the rational actor in economics, the autonomous consenting being in ethics, and the competent rights holder who is capable of pursuing and protecting his interests in human rights discourse. He informs the doctor-patient relationship, is present throughout accounts of history, psychology, political science, sociology, and so on. These underdeveloped, incomplete subjects of theory are taken out of the social relationships and institutions, which are the very structures in which we both experience vulnerability and upon which we depend for the resources to ameliorate it. These theoretical subjects are radically individualized subjects, abandoned to conceptual devices such as consent, contract, agency, and rights, which are woefully inadequate to address the inescapable and lifelong dependence on society and its institutions that our vulnerability entails. Of course, in a world in which vulnerability is resisted and autonomy and independence define the legal subject, individuals are bound to fail. And we see that all around us today in the neoliberal dystopia that has been created. The abdication of state responsibility has resulted in distinctive social harms, poverty, deprivation, and inequality for many in society. And these are individual harms. They are produced by the profound neglect or callous indifference and disregard on the part of the state to the realities of the human condition. But the harm extends beyond that which is done to the individual. Such profound neglect is a violation of the very rationale for the existence of government and law, a rejection of the responsibility and principles that legitimate the constitution of the state in the first instance. So I like to say this is a constitutional harm as well as an individual one. Recall here the second question that a vulnerability theory asks us to consider. Given our understanding of what it means to be human, what institutions, relationships, and rules are required for the construction of a just society? And here we consider the political, moral, and ethical implications of our understanding of what it means to be human when we begin by reasoning from the body, which brings us to the embedded component of the theory and the concept and importance of dependency. The fundamental reality is that the physical and developmental conditions and circumstances of the human body render us inescapably embedded in and dependent upon societal relationships and institutions throughout life. Dependency is not a variation or example of vulnerability, but its inevitable manifestation or realization. Unfortunately, we resist this realization both as individuals and as politicians and policy makers. I want to spend a minute on dependency. Dependency is complex. Dependency should not be considered only or primarily a negative state. Like vulnerability, it is profoundly generative when you think about dependency. Our innate dependency is the impetus for us as a species to come together in families, communities, to form political organizations, both local and international. Our dependency is the very basis for society and its institutions. Social relationships and structures provide the resources that simultaneously give us the ability to adapt, adjust, survive, even thrive, given our vulnerability. In vulnerability theory, we call this resilience, these ability to survive. And importantly, no one is born resilient. Rather, resilience is acquired over time within social institutions and relationships that are created and maintained by law and policy. Note that in that regard, on an individual level, dependence on social institutions varies and fluctuates over time in response to the circumstances or developmental stage in which the individual is located. So, for example, in infancy, we are inevitably dependent on care from social institutions such as the family and from individuals within that family. But the birth family recedes and other institutions typically become more prominent later in an individual's life when the need for care arises only occasionally, such as when we're ill or injured. In other words, individual dependence on any specific institutional arrangement can be thought of as episodic, alterable, and circumstantial. However, it's important to recognize and to theoretically address the reality that dependence on some set of social institutions and relationships, be they market, financial, and employment systems, or educational and healthcare, or some other combination of institutions, is inevitable and ongoing for everyone throughout life. Individual dependence on social institutions and relationships, therefore, is not deviant or exceptional. It is the norm. It is inevitable. And note here, I want to further complicate the concept of a dependence. There are two forms of individual dependence that are really relevant. First, in regard to dependence, individual dependence, we have a dependence on care, which can be characterized as biological or developmental, but also within the family who cares for this biological or developmental dependence. There are those who are assigned the social identity of caretaker, and what I call this is derivative dependency. So there's both the foundational dependency based on our bodies and the derivative dependency, which indicates that caretakers, those who take care of the biologically dependent, are themselves dependent on resources in order to successfully accomplish that care. And this second form of dependence, the derivative dependence, is not inevitable, or rather it is socially assigned, again, through the family in the first instance and these identities within the family, like caretaker in the second instance. Sometimes the resources that caretakers can rely on come from the family itself, from someone who's performing the role of spouse or partner or grandparent, but they also must come from other societal institutions. And this is important because it shows us that the concept of derivative dependency also has an institutional dimension. The family as an institution is also dependent not only on the labor of the individual caretaker, but its success, the family's success as a societal institution, is linked to the successful functioning of other social institutions, including the educational healthcare system, the employment system, and other market institutions more generally, including the welfare state. We begin to see how these institutions are symbiotically linked and how they together function to reproduce society, as well as to provide the situation or circumstances for the individual in which we live our day-to-day lives. Vulnerability theory mandates that the individual always be placed within these complex institutional contexts in thinking about how we should assess state responsibility and policies. So this is a kind of chart that summarizes or concludes what I'm talking about. From a vulnerability theory perspective, there are two significant points of focus for critical theory. Both are currently sites of failed state responsibility in many societies. First, the design and allocation of authority across societal institutions. And we see this here. You have the state who's allocating all sorts of advantages through the family system, the educational system, the employment system, these go on and on. These societal institutions and relationships we depend on ultimately are the products of law and policy. So even if the state is not visibly and actively engaged in defining these institutions, its past engagement, such as, and here particularly important, deeming some functions or some institutions as private rather than public. This affects our present arrangements. And this history of how some things are considered private while others are considered public responsibility is certainly worth exploring and critiquing. Why is the corporation, for example, considered to be a private institution in terms of setting its own standards? And why isn't it more regulated by the state? And when the state has decided not to be actively present in an institutional arrangement when it's deemed it private, it may be fruitful to inquire what or who then fills in the rules and norms in the state's absence. Who or what is making the rules, and what are those rules? Who or what is left out, and who or what is privileged and disadvantaged? We could apply this again to many private market institutions. Importantly, these societal institutions serve essential roles in the reproduction of society. They are, in fact, subsidized and supported by society for that very reason. So you listen to the political arguments for supporting a certain set of employment relationships or financial arrangements or educational arrangements, this notion that they're serving an important societal function. These institutions confer recognition and structure accommodation, supplying the often essential arrangement for future generations, as well as for those of us already in existence. We must ask, how effectively do these societal institutions provide either the individual resilience and or the societal benefits that justify their existence? And as already noted, the interinstitutional relationships represented here are complex. The family, the workplace, the financial system, and so on are parts of a larger whole, symbiotically arranged. The particular proportion, collaborations, and limitations of these interinstitutional relationships are not accidental, natural, or inevitable, but the products of policy and political choice. These arrangements, these institutional arrangements, provide another source for critical commentary. Now, a second focus here in this particular chart for a point of focus and critique is the intra-institutional arrangements. And here we're looking at this social identities, the second identity, set of identities here, the individual social identities that are created within each institution. These constructed social identities correspond to the social functions of the institution in which they are located. So the family system, which handles dependence, creates the parent, child, husband, wife, dealing with caretaking and so on, educational system and everything. But they detail the roles that individuals are to assume within those institutions. Now note, these social identities are paired, complementary, and often, of necessity, unequal relationships. The parent-child relationship, for example, is not an equal relationship, nor is employer-employee, shareholder-consumer, doctor-patient, lender-borrower. They're performing different functions, paired functions, related complementary functions within society. And these institutional identities, these social identities, are also legal identities. The law defines individual responsibility in this way for the reproduction of society. And this is accomplished using mundane, everyday law such as contracts, corporations, employment, family, criminal, tort law, and so on. So these institutional identities are defining our relationship with each other. The structure of these identities, like the institutions in which they are shaped, also affect everyone in society. So we can choose, for example, not to become a parent, but we are affected by the policies that are directed to parents. If they cannot be, should not be equal, how do we determine if and when these unequal relationships are just? Who should be privileged and why, for example, in the employer-employee relationship? Who should have the advantages in that context and why? Vulnerability theory explores both the institutional and individual relationships of distribution, but it does so by placing the vulnerable subject and dependency at the center of law and displacing the autonomous, independent, liberal subject that now dominates our theory. And in doing so, vulnerability theory poses important questions about how we understand both justice and responsibility. And it also provides a critique of the status quo, as well as a way to imagine a better and, I hope, more just future. So thank you, and I'll be interested in your comments and observations and questions.
Thank you very much, Martha. A lot for us to think about, and again, because we've been so engaged with the human rights discourse. I'm going to open it up to the audience first, and then also just those of you who are online, if you just put your virtual hand up to ask a question. Don't see any questions at the moment, so maybe I'll start. So one thing that really struck me kind of the last few days thinking about it was this notion of universality and how we look at universality when we talk about human rights, that human rights are universal. And then how does that juxtapose to this notion of human as embedded and embodied, and ultimately the universal there is that of vulnerability. So is there a way that you can compare these two, or is vulnerability theory moving away from the human rights discourse?
Well, I view it as a move away from both a rights and a social contract way of thinking about state responsibility, because it's not focused on the individual. I mean, I think one of the difficulties with the implementation of a human rights perspective is that often it deteriorates into a competition between rights and individuals who hold rights and how we define rights and all of those things, which is why I think it's important that vulnerability theory, again, reasons from the body, from the universality of the body. So there can't be an argument about the nature of the body, the ontological, developmental, biological body. We are all subject to the same laws of nature. And then we can think there's a wide variation on how we organize societies in response to that reality, which is where we should be arguing politically and so forth and so on. But that is the empirical reality, it seems to me, rather than arguing about what constitutes a right and who makes that determination and who can give it and what are the circumstances, which is what happens in so much of the human right analysis.
Just looking at Professor Linda Hogan is going to come up to ask a question.
Thank you very much, Professor Fineman, for absolutely riveting analysis and I think this introduction, as you've done, introducing this language of vulnerability into the kind of political theory, as opposed to, the purely abstract philosophical discourse, has been very important. I have two questions. One is, I was struck by the way what you said about, you know, the answer to what is it to be human. That's an empirical answer, and I agree that it has an empirical component for sure. But I wonder, is it not does that not also require a kind of a philosophical, embedded philosophical answer? So it's not only about the empirical reality, it's also about, you know, what we envision, wish, project for ourselves and for other people. So I just wonder about, you know, whether it is just an empirical question. Maybe you didn't say just empirical, but
No. Can I answer that? Because it's really an important question to make that distinction. And so if I could answer that now, before we get to your second question, I'd like to. It is an empirical question for me. The body itself as an empirical reality is really relates to the way that this is phrased in terms of vulnerability and the human condition. So our human condition is the inevitable change that occurs over time in both our physical and social well-being. And this happens across history, across societies. This is the empirical, bodily based reality of the human condition. So when you're introducing these other concepts, I'd like to make a distinction here between the human condition as a biological matter, empirical matter, and what is often referred to as human nature, which is the product of history, of, you know, norms and values, culture, the notion which is aspirational, it's produced within societies and tends to change. So our view of human nature, are people inherently good? Are they inherently bad? You know, those sorts of questions tend to, again, to be constructed or to be part of a culture, but independent from the reality of the material and biological developmental body. So I would actually put the notion of what does it mean to be human in terms of what does that mean about our ultimate philosophical, psychological, whatever, religious perspective, as again, in the notion, a product of our embeddedness in social institutions and relationships, including religion. I understand this is a group that's studying religion and human rights. Human rights is another way of thinking about, you know, what is the aspiration, what is the human nature, liberty seeking, all of these sorts of things are actually constructs. I hope that answers this.
It does, absolutely. That is very helpful. Thank you. The second question, which was a follow-on, so it may be redundant, but let me just ask it anyway. It's about, you know, I'm thinking about, say, for example, the work of Judith Butler and her way of arguing that vulnerability is structured into into the human, I'm using your language now, the human condition by virtue of our not our embodiedness so much as our relationality, you know, and so, you know, she argues that vulnerability is sort of the prior kind of condition of human beings. I suppose you would say from our sociality, I suppose, rather than our embodied nature. I'm just wondering, where is that also part of the embeddedness strand of your thinking about how vulnerability is structured into the human condition in all its dimensions?
Well, Butler, as I understand Butler, which is not always easy, but anyway, in any case, she's really concerned with vulnerability in terms of the ability to be wounded or harmed. And, you know, a lot of her work addresses that. But aside from that, it's a really much more individualized. Again, the emphasis of a vulnerability analysis, from my perspective, is not the individual's ability to be injured or wounded or whatever is of concern, but rather how we define institutional responsibility. So it really is focused more on institutions. Now, you could say that Butler is doing that when she talks about relationality, but most of the people who work in that context are really concerned with individual relationships, what I would call the social identities, again, that are constructed within these social institutions that are created through law and policy. And then because of the particular function envisioned for those social institutions, that also helps to define the relationships, the social identities of individuals within those relationships. So it's a more, again, governmental, which I know Butler also resists the notion of governmentality, inherent suspicion of the state. And so it's a very different perspective. I don't know if I explained that as clearly as, but hers is highly individualized and tends to focus again on the idea of injury or harm or woundedness in terms of vulnerability. But it's really important, again, the way that I see our vulnerability is that it is the basis for social organizations. We would not survive as a species without institutions such as the family, and the family differs in its construction over time and cultures and so forth, but some caretaking institution providing for the physical dependency is necessary in every society. Same thing with health, same thing with finance, the same thing. In any case, those institutions vary, but their social functions is the same.
Thank you very much. I don't want to hog the conversation. I'm sure other people want to ask a question. Yeah, so there's somebody else coming up. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Hello. Hi. So first of all, thank you for this very interesting talk. And so I have a question as I am doing my PhD here at Trinity College, and I'm interested in post-conflict societies. And I'm thinking about like the example of Northern Ireland, for example, and when the institution failed to provide support in a post-conflict society, and then you can see that the communities involved in the conflict, they strengthen their bond, because basically what I think it's maybe also a sort of dependency between their members, just to make up for the failure of the institution to provide a solution and to provide support. So I was wondering, how do you see those communities in the vulnerability theory? And if you see this as some form of resilience?
I do see the communities and communities that are organized around all sorts of identities as providing resilience, and you see that. I mean, one of the major ways, since given the way that we define the political subject as autonomous, independent, and so forth, and so on, and state responsibility as limited and restrained, what the communities provide is a way to claim that the state should be more involved in advancing their interests. So those communities then can form around the notion that the state has failed that particular community. And this is concepts like discrimination or oppression or domination or marginalization arise there. Again, a vulnerability analysis would not take that, would make an expansive notion to include all communities before it begins to look at who's left out, but that would be the focus on the universal that should come first. So that these individual identities do form or do provide a form of resilience. The identity itself becomes a basis for political organization, for legitimacy in making claims on the state. But I do want to say about resilience, The fact that something has resilience or provides resilience is not necessarily a good thing. You have to be able to criticize that too, because there are ideologies, there are things that provide resilience that in fact have very negative consequences on individuals and notions of justice. So the ability to survive, I mean, the ability to wage war or to have nuclear weapons is a form of resilience. So it provides empowerment in the context of international relationships. That doesn't mean that it's a good thing and something that we shouldn't fight against. So, again, don't mistake resilience as always a positive. It can, in fact, racism is very resilient, for example. We see that, and that is not a good form of resilience.
No, absolutely. That's what I was interested in, like the fact that this is a form of resilience, so it provides some sort of support to the communities, but also it also leads to polarization and more and more extreme. So.
Well, and worse than polarization, although that's certainly there, it also, again, undermines the notion of collective responsibility. So it says, okay, everything's fine except for this group, this individual group. And if you just correct the problems here, everything will, if you just make them the same, equal treatment, if you stop discrimination, then everything will be perfect because the underlying institutions are good. And that, in my estimation, is often, if not always, untrue. The fundamental institutional arrangements need addressing. And often our attention on specific targeted harms deflects from that universal problem.
Okay, thank you so much.
So we have Professor Dan Kilper online who has a question. Dan, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Professor Fineman. Appreciate your presentation there. Really enjoyed it. Actually, so I want to expand on the previous question a little bit. And one of the things that I struggle with vulnerability theory, well, yesterday we heard from Michael Perry about bringing in this notion of he would say brotherhood or basically goodwill towards others. And I feel like something is lacking in the idea of vulnerability, that we need an additional notion of this kind of goodwill to make it all work. And especially I'm concerned about this idea of vulnerability. And I'm with you very much in using that to describe sort of the human condition, but the danger that turns into a justification then for the state to come in and say, well, you're more vulnerable, you're not well educated, we're going to take your children away from you and educate them separately, and all sorts of harms that might arise. How do you speak to that?
Well, to start with the last one, that's what's happening now, because we misunderstand the concept of vulnerability. So again, what we vulnerability theorists resist is the whole notion of vulnerable populations or particular specific vulnerability or more or less vulnerable. This is vulnerability as weakness, as deviation, as, this is not, again, from a vulnerability perspective, vulnerability is universal. It's our embodiment. What you're talking about is our embedded, where are we embedded within these social institutions and arrangements? And a vulnerability analysis would say, let's look at those social institutions and arrangements and see how responsive they are, in fact, to the entire human condition. So it does away with exactly the kind of targeted, that means the targeted nature of the way that we think about vulnerability, weakness, disadvantage, discrimination, and so forth and so on, that actually risks these kinds of misapprehensions. But I guess also, and I began with this, is so much of critical theory views the state as inherently problematic and intervention as problematic and oppressive and so forth and so on. And that it has been true historically and otherwise. But what a vulnerability theory does is to recognize the inevitability of some governing authority to set the rules that govern our relationship with each other and our relationship with whatever that governing authority is. And again, there's multiple sources for that, but a vulnerability analysis would say the best possibility can come from a democratically organized state, which is inclusive in its orientation, not from market institutions, not from religion, not from, you know, the Proud Boys and waves of individuals who think that they know best for what the world is, that actually it's the collective that has the best chance of achieving justice. So, so I think that both of those things, both the vulnerable populations approach and this inherent rejection of the state as the possible site for inclusive, progressive policies are inherent in that second question that you asked. And when Michael's talking about, I don't know if you read the critique that I did of, no, not critique, but response to Michael's notion. Again, he begins with the abstract notion of rights, and it's his idiosyncratic application of a human rights analysis, or the morality of human rights, which he actually finds within, you know, again, within a very closed discourse, unrelated to the realities, in my opinion, the realities of our inherent vulnerability. So he starts with that abstraction, and he refers to these notions of brotherhood. Well, first of all, I think I mentioned this, the notion that perhaps that was the wrong family relationship. A vulnerability analysis wouldn't be this relationship among equals necessarily, or primarily, again, because of the inherent inequality that's factored in an ultimate, inevitable, unavoidable dependence on social institutions and relationships. And quite often it's not brotherhood, it's not a relationship of equals, but a relationship of inequality, parent-child, employer-employee, so, you know, across the board, doctor-patient, teacher-student. And the question should not be how brothers would react in that context, but how, in fact, a caring parent, maybe if you want to use family metaphors, how would a caring parent be constructed in the context of those inherent relationships? These are relationships of unequal access to resources, unequal access to institutional responses. Take the doctor-patient relationship, for example. We pretend that's a relationship of equality, and we devise these things like informed consent, or employers and employees. We make up something called the employment contract, which papers everything over with notions of equality, like brotherhood does, rather than recognizing the difference inherent in those social relationships, the different access to resources, the different access to institutional, that we should have an asymmetric sense of responsibility for these inherently unequal relationships. So I don't know if that makes sense to you or not, but vulnerability analysis questions exactly the kind of reliance that Michael makes in his paper on these, again, on these abstract concepts that sound great, but when you begin to look at how they get applied, it, to me at least, raises some problems.
But I'm still confused on how you apply this vulnerability analysis. So what's the metric that you're using to distinguish what's a positive form of resilience or a negative, or how do you apply that analysis? Somehow I'm missing it. What is the guiding principle there?
I see. You want answers. All right. You want absolutes. A vulnerability analysis tells us that that's exactly the wrong thing to ask. That, you know, the really important question, in my opinion, in any kind of theoretical or critical approach has to be, first of all, what questions are you asking? And, you know, so what is it that you really care about? And what a vulnerability approach tries to do is to focus you on the way that these decisions or these questions are going to get played out in the context of society. So it doesn't tell you what the right answer is. It tells you what the right questions might be, or different questions than you might ask then, for example, do I have a right to something, a different way of arguing, a different way of presenting your, but the ultimate resolution, these are political questions. These are, again, the second question, the first question, what does it mean to be human? The vulnerability question. The second question, what does that mean for the way we organize society? That's a political question. And one of the reasons I think vulnerability analysis has found a home in diverse legal cultures. It's been translated into Chinese, it's been translated into Italian, it's been, there's satellite projects in the UK, in Sweden, of all places. It's Latin America now, it's being translated into Portuguese. And the reason I think is because it doesn't tell you what the right answer is. It gives you a way for you to determine for your society what the right answer should be. That question of how should we organize our society, given, again, the empirical realization of vulnerability and its implications, this dependence on social institutions and relationships. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
I think it does, but I just want to make sure that I understand correctly. So when you say vulnerability analysis, you're saying that someone should ask those two questions. That's what you mean by vulnerability analysis?
Well, I think what a vulnerability analysis should do. So when we look at the workplace, again, when we look at the employment relationship, let's just take that relationship. A vulnerability analysis would say, unlike many analyses, that both the employer and the employee are vulnerable in that context. That they are positioned, again, in this complementary relationship. So they are both vulnerable to social forces like economic downturns and so forth and so on, but they are differently vulnerable. And that the political question, so it's the analysis of recognizing, again, the universal aspect of vulnerability, the fact that, again, we are all located in these social institutions, regardless of what our position is, that first one. But then the political question becomes, how do we then allocate the risk associated with economic instability among employers and employees? How do we define those social relationships in a just way? So it's a different set of analysis. A lot of the critique, for example, of employment relationships starts off with only focusing on workers. And that's certainly important. And of course, they are the most disadvantaged, and we see that all the time. But you can't help, or you can't expect good social policy to just develop out of this notion of taking one part of this inherent, necessary, essential social relationship and focusing only on that. And then they become in competition instead of trying to work out what's the just allocation of privilege and responsibility in the context of this relationship. So it's a much more complex analysis that's required.
Okay, thank you. I'll let others go.
So I see, thank you, Dan. I see Somaya has a question, but we have two questions before that. So Anu, if you want to come up. Then.
Thank you for this talk. I just have a question in terms of what you think, if it is possible for the state to be this place where we can collectively think of each other. Like I'm specifically thinking of the US right now and abolition, and how we're turning instead to mutual aid projects and relying on one another in the sense of community, recognizing that we are in different ways vulnerable to the US and what it does to its communities that are basically marginalized. So I just wanted to ask what you think the future is for the state, or if it is even possible that we can exist in this way where we think of one another as differently vulnerable and look out for one another in that regard.
Well, again, I wouldn't put it in terms of differently vulnerable. Again, vulnerability is the inherent condition. So I would start with that. But I think if there isn't any possibility for the state to organize itself in a way that's inclusive and just, then there's no hope, it seems to me. So certainly can't rely on corporations to do that. Certainly can't rely on, individual organizations that have only a narrow set of self-interest at their center to do that. That what we need and what law has taken up as its objective is a kind of universal set ways of establishing rules. Again, we can't escape these rules that are going to be set for us. The only thing that we can try and do is affect how those rules, who and how those rules are actually generated. And it seems to me inappropriate to concede that at this point to market forces, which is what essentially we've done over the past several generations.
Thank you, Martha. Do you want to come up?
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I have a background in psychology, so I'm usually more at a micro level. And so for me, it's a very new perspective. But I was wondering in your talk, so in the beginning, you started in explaining that vulnerability is also something, or like, no, you asked what makes us human, and vulnerability is something that defines us. And also like in bodily vulnerability, for example. And to me, this felt like a micro level, like macro level, like individual person vulnerability. And then later in the end, you showed us a graph that goes from the from the macro to the micro. And so I was wondering kind of at which level of analysis are you working, or like vulnerability theories, and like whether it's going bottom up or top down, or so, yeah, if you could specify this, or as someone who's not from that field.
Yeah. Well, again, and this is really important, and I know this is a shift that is not easy to make, but what I'm asking you to do is to not focus on the individual subject as vulnerable. Although we begin there, vulnerability, but again, vulnerability as a universal, as the human condition, as located within our embodiment and its susceptibility to change and the dependency that means. So that's the place to start. And I have to start there because of the way that we typically begin, which is the notion of an autonomous, independent individual existing out here in interaction or relationship with other individuals, but maintaining some integrity as an individual, as a separate entity. And what vulnerability theory tells us is, as wonderful as that sounds, given, again, our bodily realities, we are all dependent and located our entire existence within social institutions and relationships that are beyond our individual definition and control. That is the social, political, physical, material reality. And most of us don't deal with that. And so what vulnerability theory asks us to do is actually address that. And it does so, again, not by focusing on the position of the individual, the poor individual, but rather looking at the institutional arrangements in which we all live our day-to-day lives. How is the family organized? How is the workplace organized? How is the financial system organized? So, and the relationship among those institutions, those social institutions. So what's the relationship between the workplace and the family? Does the workplace accommodate the family? Does the workplace accommodate caretaking, for example? What's the dependency of the family on the workplace? What does that look like? How about the financial system? What about the healthcare system? How do all of these social institutions work together? That is the first important thing to look at. Within those social institutions, there are also defined individual identities, social identities, so that we all occupy these institutions simultaneously. We are both in the family, in the workplace, in the educational system, in the financial system. Each of those institutions also has expectations, obligations that are defined by the social relationship, employer-employee, parent-child, teacher-student, doctor, patient. How are those relationships defined? That's the way the individual is actually impacted, again, within these, but there's an interaction between those. The organization of this social institution will affect the individual identities within that social institution. So, it's a complex set of analysis that's looking ultimately into the question of how it is that we structure these social relationships, these universal social relationships, the infrastructure of our society in a way that's just. So it's a different set of questions than normally people are looking at.
There's a question in the chat, which I'll read out. It's from Somaya. It says, hello, I'm a PhD student from engineering department. What we see in my field that while research is conducted or maybe technological development, trials are based on a small group of people to evaluate if it's good for everyone to be more resilient or not. How do you see this technological aspect in terms of vulnerability theory?
So there are now dozens of articles and books that have been written on vulnerability theory. And so people that are really interested in this and following it up, because it's hard to convey in an hour and a half presentation, I would urge you to do that. In terms of, there's been a really interesting development with a number of people using vulnerability theory in the context of thinking about the ethical system that should govern engineers and technology, particularly in regard to artificial intelligence. So there's a number of pieces that have been written. There's now a book on that's looked at, again, artificial intelligence and the responsibility, the professional responsibility of computer engineers and so forth in the context of developing the standards that are going to govern the development of technology. So there's a lot, again, these individual applications of vulnerability theory, which I was giving you the theory itself, not all its various applications. So for example, there's a book written about vulnerability in the employment context, in the family context, as it applies to contracts, as it applies to property. There's no end to the specific applications of vulnerability theory, but since that's an engineering question, this is a particularly interesting one that I am not personally involved in, but people are, and I can put you in touch with them if you're interested.
Thank you very much, Martha. Any other questions from the audience here? I don't know if you're thinking of putting your hand up or not. I was just going to follow up what Dan said around kind of, wanting an answer. And again, I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit here, because again, going from kind of thinking about in the human rights discourse and system, because you have a framework and then there's accountability. And so I've been thinking about this a while now, because I was last week at a meeting with human rights defenders, and we even call them human rights defenders. And then when it comes to helping them, there is you look at the human rights framework, all the advocacy, all the lobbying, everything is done within this human rights framework, because there is some sort of state accountability if they have signed and ratified these international conventions and covenant and so on. So your theory resonates a lot, especially if you go from individual to community, because one of the things that came up at this meeting was that the human rights defenders, especially from Global South, they work much more within community, whereas this organization, or generally the human rights framework, we kind of you look at individual rights rather than community collective. But then when you come back to the vulnerability theory, how can you keep states accountable? Where does that accountability come? Because obviously, you're still working on this. You don't have this framework. So that kind of was, I think, where Dan was coming from as well. Possibly, he's not here anymore.
Okay. Well, a couple of things about that, and again, it's we have to talk about it in more detail. But the dispute between community rights and individual rights, I think, is a good example of why you need vulnerability theory. And this is as old as, well, it was started long before I ever entered academia, with the notion of how we define the community's control over the individual. And this is particularly important in the religious context. And it came up in terms of veiling, in terms of genital alteration surgery. It's come up in a variety of different contexts. So, again, the notion of how do we position the individual and how do we position the collective? Here, the context of the collective. So it shows why, again, you have to take a step back and think about what it is that we want to achieve. Again, not vulnerability theory doesn't provide the answers, but it asks a different set of questions. So in the context of religion and the distinct community versus the individual right, one of the things that would is, but how is that community positioned? So it's not only the community and the individual, but it's the community within the larger context of the state itself. So the question is not only how does the individual fit within the religious community, but how does the religious community fit within, and how should it be coordinated within the goals or objectives or values or norms of the larger society? So, these questions are, again, very complex, and I can understand, or I do understand, why people want to paper those over or perhaps not ignore them. But again, what a vulnerability analysis says to us is that that is not ultimately very productive, that it doesn't remove those questions. And really what we have to do if we want progress is to engage on a different level than we have been, so that you can have a group that thinks that this is a right to be advocated for, and a group that thinks that their rights, in fact, interfere with that, or in opposition to that. If that's the debate, that's the nature of the debate, whoever is most powerful, I suppose, wins. But that doesn't really resolve the question of what would be the just answer. Again, and that is a product of bringing the sides together, bringing people together, not positioning them in opposition to each other. And so I don't know if that addresses what you're doing, but I'm asking you to think about things differently. And I know that's, many people don't want to do that, but a vulnerability analysis, if you're interested in that, that's what it's asking you to do.
That's yep. That makes us think a lot. And again, you have when you're so embedded within one theory, and again, the participants here have met activists and practitioners and scholars, and will the rest of the week as well. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Martha. You want to?
I was going to say, someone asked in the chat, I just saw this, about the environment.
Yes.
I have a postdoc, Tiano Samandari, who's been looking, one of the things she does is to consider the alternative of a human rights analysis to environmental problems with a vulnerability analysis. A vulnerability analysis is extremely important in the environmental context, and again, approaches it from a very different position and leads to a very, very different set of questions, particularly in where a vulnerability approach locates, again, the individual within the larger collective. And a vulnerability analysis also allows bringing in intergenerational kinds of concerns, and here is particularly important in the environment, in the way that a rights analysis typically does not, because then you get into the debate between those in existence versus future generations and all of that kind of stuff. But a vulnerability analysis, again, because what it looks at is the way institutions and relationships reproduce society. The government, the fundamental role of the state is to ultimately reproduce itself, and it does so through the generation and perpetuation and managing of these institutions and relationships, so that you can make that argument in the context of the environment, I think, quite effectively. So whoever it was that raised that question in the chat, I can put you in touch with Atiano and her work if you're interested in looking at that aspect of it.
So it's one of our participants, you can email us to put you in touch with Martha. Any other questions from the floor? No, that's already answered. That's already answered. Again, there is no, I keep seeing hands kind of go up and down a little bit, but yeah, like just one more question that I have, and you talked about your work being translated into different languages and from like China to South America, and again, I do wonder like how would this theory translate within different cultural setting, and you know, and different states as well, and can it, again, playing devil's advocate a little bit here, could it be misused within certain regimes? For example, you know, we talked about Iran a lot, where the idea of collective and culture and religion is sometimes used to suppress.
Anything can be misused, as we, all you have to do is look around and see any idea can be misused, can be picked up and appropriated and misused. So this is part of, again, what I take as my obligation as a scholar is to struggle in exactly this context. And we all have a responsibility. So it's not only the state, but in fact, we are the state. We are involved in a process that generates those rules. So all of us have to be involved to make sure that things are not misused. That's the political battle, again, over what constitutes justice and what does not. So yeah, just to make that clear, there are no perfect resolutions. There is no concept or idea that can't be manipulated by people who want to do so. And the best that we can do is to understand clearly what it is that we're trying to advocate, what are the circumstances and the limitations of our own position, and to articulate as clearly as we can what the advantages are in that context. So I don't know if that helps, but.
Professor Hogan is coming up to ask another question, and this will be our last question as well.
Yeah, my apologies for since we have time,
Yeah,
I just asked this question. So it's, when you say, which I think is really interesting, vulnerability theory requires us to ask different kinds of questions. And then when we expect or hope that the democratic state can be an institution that facilitates this inclusive interrogation dialogue about how you know, how justice can be achieved in particular circumstance or contexts. I'm wondering, is this an essentially sort of always deliberative, inductive process? And are there institutions of the state or particular ways that states can structure deliberation that will allow for, you know, more inclusive conversations and therefore more more meaningful ways of engaging the sort of the complex vulnerabilities that we that human beings sort of reflect or embody? Absolutely.
And in fact, I can think of some examples. And again, this is the notion of how the theory gets implemented. I usually, again, usually in discussions, people get stuck on the concept of vulnerability. So to move them to state responsibility is always a challenge. But once we get to state responsibility, the question is how does it get implemented? And here it's really important. This is not like some grand theory that comes down and throws a blanket over everything. This involves a struggle on each of these institutional levels, and within those institutions, each of these social identity levels, again, contracts, family law, employment law, that all of those mundane areas of law are in fact involved. But it's looking at these institutions, how it is that we factor those. So examples would be in the United States, and there's very few examples in the United States, but one is environmental impact rules that say before you do a project, you have to assess the environmental impact. Does that resolve the questions? No, but it raises the issues that should be part of the political process. The same thing you see in the context of in the UK, where they have commissioners on children, the commissioner of children, and they're tasked and they're funded, and they use universities and other experts to bring in information about how each piece of any piece of legislation is going to impact children. Again, it doesn't tell you the answers, it doesn't answer the questions. What it does is to generate a series of important questions about impact of policy that might otherwise be kind of papered over in the context of the political. So again, this is not like some, oh, grand, here I come on my white horse to solve all the problems and give you all the answers. This is a way to define struggle. And again, in response to Ruja's question earlier, the reason that I think it's finding a home in so many different legal cultures is because it doesn't do that. It doesn't tell you what the answer should be. It tells you a way to analyze for your own set of institutions and relationships, whether to raise the questions about their justice. So it relies on any particular society's way that they've organized themselves. It doesn't impose one ideal way of doing it. So I don't know if that helps, but again, I think there are models that we just had one in New Jersey where the governor, in addressing corporate misuse of resources, just imposed a set of really minor legislation that shifted the cost of corporations kind of buying up everything and then leaving the jurisdiction, leaving everybody, the workers and the communities desperate. Just a small series of adjustments to the law about bankruptcy, which raised the cost for corporations to engage. That's the kind of reform, again, not flashy, tremendous, exciting reforms, but reforms that matter to people's real lives.
Thank you very much. I'll hand back over to Roja.
Thank you very much, Martha. That was really, really excellent, and it gives us a lot to think about. And we have a very interdisciplinary audience as well. Usually, the human rights summer school is mostly students with background in law. So I think, your vulnerability theory really resonates with many here. Let's thank Professor Fineman for her time, and in person in Dublin soon as well.
Well, I hope that anybody who's interested, please, Ruja, I hope you would make my information available. And in the context of religion, one of the things that we're going to be doing next year is looking at the interaction between religious principles and vulnerability theory with the Center for Religion at Emory. So anybody who's interested in that project, you can participate virtually also. So please get in touch.
That's great. I can share that with everybody. Thank you very much again, and see you soon. Bye.
Bye.